I used to be afraid of silence. Now it's the only peace I have. Frank McCarthy sat by his window, gazing at the empty street outside, a slight chill in the air reminding him of the changing seasons, much like the changes in his life. At 62, he had thought he would never find peace in solitude. The house was empty now. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years ago, and his children were scattered across the country, living their own lives. But Frank wasn't sad. He wasn't lonely either. He had learned to embrace the quiet. It wasn't something that happened overnight. For months after Margaret's death, Frank had struggled with the silence, the emptiness of the house. He had missed her laugh, the way she filled the space with her presence. But eventually, something shifted inside him. Maybe it was the realization that he no longer had to meet anyone's expectations or be anyone's anchor. There was freedom in that, in being completely on your own, without the pressure to perform, to please, or to care for anyone else. And that freedom felt surprisingly good. Frank stood up from his chair and walked toward the kitchen, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he passed the photograph of Margaret on the mantel. He had come to terms with her absence, not through sadness, but through acceptance. And in that acceptance, he found something he hadn't expected: peace. Peace in being alone. Frank woke up early, as he always did now. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the floor. He made himself a cup of coffee, just the way Margaret used to, strong, black, no sugar. It was a small ritual, but it comforted him. The house was still quiet, too quiet for some, but for Frank, it felt like home. The silence no longer felt heavy. He thought about his children, how they called once a week, maybe twice. They were busy, living their own lives. He was proud of them, of course, but in those moments, he often wondered when his life had shifted. When had he stopped fearing the empty spaces? The house, once filled with laughter and the hustle of everyday life, had become a peaceful retreat. Frank had learned to live in the silence, to fill it with the sounds of his own thoughts. He had started taking long walks, finding new places in the town that he had never noticed before. He began to appreciate the simplicity of those moments, the way the wind felt on his face or the sound of birdsong in the early morning. It was not the life he had imagined, but it was his life now. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind being alone. Frank had never expected that life after 60 would feel this way. It was not about the loneliness he had feared. It was about discovering himself, about exploring the spaces he had once overlooked. A few weeks ago, he had decided to take a trip on his own. He drove to a small town about 2 hours away, not knowing what to expect, but feeling a strange sense of excitement. He had rented a small cabin by the lake, away from the noise, away from the people who had their own lives. For the first time, Frank wasn't rushing to make plans or fill his day with distractions. He simply sat by the water, watching the ripples form on the surface. He thought about Margaret. He always did, of course. But this time, there was no sadness, no overwhelming grief. There was only a quiet appreciation for what had been, and for what he still had: his memories, his health, and most importantly, his newfound independence. As the sun began to set, Frank realized something. He had spent so many years living for others, trying to meet expectations and be everything for everyone. Now, in his 60s, he was living for himself. And that was enough. He smiled as he packed up his things and headed back to the car, not sure where the road would take him next, but feeling more alive than he had in years. Frank returned home from his trip with a new sense of clarity. The small getaway had been a turning point, a reminder that he was still capable of finding joy and fulfillment, even in solitude. Back in his familiar surroundings, the house no longer felt as cold as it once did. He had embraced the quiet, and it had embraced him back. His days no longer felt empty. He had found a routine that worked for him. He would spend his mornings at the local coffee shop, reading the newspaper and chatting with the barista, a young woman who always had a smile and a kind word. In the afternoons, Frank would visit the park, walking the same path he had seen so many times before, but now he noticed the small details: the way the leaves danced in the wind, the sound of children playing in the distance, the old oak tree that had stood for decades. There was a beauty in the ordinary, and Frank had learned to appreciate it. As the days passed, he realized that he had stopped looking for something to fill the emptiness. He was no longer searching for validation or meaning from others. The peace he had found was his own, and he had learned that there was strength in embracing the moments when no one else was around. Frank smiled to himself as he watched the sunset, feeling a deep sense of contentment that he had never imagined he would experience again. Frank hadn't expected a visit from his son, but when the knock came at the door one Saturday morning, it wasn't unwelcome. His son, Peter, had always been the busy one, constantly traveling for work, barely able to visit. But today, he stood at the doorstep, looking uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure how to start the conversation. "Hey, Dad, got a minute?" Peter asked, his voice sounding softer than usual. Frank nodded and stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. They sat in the living room, the same room where Frank had spent countless hours with Margaret. There was an awkward silence before Peter spoke again. "I've been thinking, maybe you should come live with us for a while." Frank looked at his son, surprised by the suggestion. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the offer, but after all this time, Frank had grown used to his independence. "I'm doing just fine here, Peter," Frank said, his voice calm but firm. He could see the concern in his son's eyes, but he wasn't ready to leave his home yet. Peter hesitated before continuing. "I know, Dad. I don't want you to be alone forever." Frank leaned back, the words sinking in. He understood the concern, but he had found something that Peter hadn't yet grasped. "I'm not alone, Peter," Frank replied quietly. "I have myself, and that's enough for now." Peter didn't argue, but Frank could tell the conversation wasn't over. It was the first time his son had seen him not as a father to depend on, but as a man who had found peace in his solitude. Frank spent the next few days reflecting on his conversation with Peter. The suggestion to move in with his son had lingered in his mind, but it didn't feel right. He was at peace in his own home, in the space where he had built his life, raised his family, and made his memories. The idea of leaving it all behind, even for a while, seemed impossible. Frank had worked so hard for this quiet, this solitude. It was his reward for years of living for others. He had spent so many years taking care of people, making sure everyone else's needs were met. Now, for the first time, he could focus on his own needs, his own desires. A few days later, Peter called again. "Dad, I just wanted to check in. Are you sure about staying there alone? We really don't mind having you. It would be good for you to have some company." Frank could hear the concern in his son's voice, and part of him felt guilty for not accepting the offer. But another part of him knew that he couldn't abandon what he had found. "I'm fine, Peter. Really, I've got everything I need here. I'm not as lonely as you think." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Peter finally responded. "Okay, Dad. Just know we're here if you ever change your mind." Frank hung up the phone, feeling a weight lift off his chest. He wasn't ready to leave this chapter of his life behind just yet. He had learned to live for himself, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and life returned to its gentle rhythm for Frank. He had begun to accept that this was his life now, not in the way he had once feared, but in a way that brought him contentment. The quiet no longer felt like an enemy. It had become a companion, one that sat with him in the evenings as he read his books or listened to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. One afternoon, Frank sat by the window, the familiar warmth of sunlight washing over him. He noticed how the shadows had shifted, how the seasons were slowly changing. The house, once filled with the bustle of family, now echoed with his footsteps alone. But it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, full of moments that had shaped him. He thought about the old oak tree in the backyard, the one he and Margaret had planted years ago. It had grown taller with each passing year, just as he had. Frank had grown too, in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't the same man he had been before Margaret's passing. He had become someone stronger, more resilient. He had learned to find peace in solitude, to appreciate the beauty of his own company. The phone rang. It was Peter again. "Hey, Dad, how's it going?" Peter's voice was light, but Frank could hear the underlying concern. "I'm good, Peter," Frank said with a smile, his voice steady. "I'm doing just fine here. I'm at peace." There was a pause before Peter responded. "I'm glad to hear that, Dad. Just remember, you're not alone." Frank leaned back in his chair, feeling the truth of those words in his heart. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the months went by, Frank found himself more at peace than he had ever been. The worries of the past seemed like distant memories, faded and soft. He had started to take joy in the small things, watching the birds at the feeder in the morning, sipping his coffee while reading the paper, taking evening walks along the quiet streets of his neighborhood. It was a simple life, but one that felt full. Sometimes, when he woke up in the morning and saw the sun shining through the window, he would think of Margaret. She would have loved this peaceful rhythm they had created together. But now, it was his rhythm, and he had learned to embrace it fully. Frank's mind was clearer now, his heart lighter. He had stopped measuring his worth by the approval or expectations of others. He no longer needed validation from his children or anyone else. He was enough, just as he was. It was a revelation that had come slowly, like the change of seasons, and now it felt like freedom. One evening, as he sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank thought about how far he had come. He had once feared that he would not know how to live without the constant company of others. But he had discovered something more powerful. He had learned to live with himself. And in that, he found a strength he had never known before. He smiled, feeling the cool evening breeze on his face. For the first time in a long while, he truly felt content. It was a Sunday afternoon when Frank received a call from Peter. His son's voice was calm, but there was a note of uncertainty in it. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe we should plan a visit soon. It's been a while." Frank had gotten used to the distance between them, the silent understanding that both of them were moving forward in their own ways. Frank thought about it for a moment, then replied, "I'm doing fine, Peter. I've got everything I need here." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Peter spoke again. "I just want to make sure you're all right. We miss you." Frank felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet gratitude for the love that was still there, even if unspoken. "I'm all right, Peter," Frank said softly, "and I'm not alone. I've found peace." There was a long silence before Peter responded, his voice softer now. "I'm glad to hear that, Dad. You've always been strong." After the call ended, Frank sat back in his chair, his mind wandering to the years that had passed, to the life he had lived, and to the unexpected peace he had found in solitude. The weight of the past had lifted, and in its place was something lighter, something that felt like freedom. Frank had learned, over time, that he didn't need anyone else to complete him. He was whole, just as he was. He smiled to himself, feeling a sense of contentment settle over him. He was enough. And for the first time in years, he truly believed it.